I still remember the rain that night, thick, heavy, almost suffocating. It pounded against the stained glass windows of our mansion, each drop echoing through the long, empty hallways like a slow funeral march. Maybe it was a sign. Maybe the universe was trying to warn me. I was 22, fresh out of college, eager to finally step into my rightful place in Blackwell Industries, the empire my grandfather had built and my father had expanded. I had spent years preparing, business school, internships, studying every financial report, every contract, every board decision. This company was in my blood, my legacy. Or so I thought. That night, my father summoned me to his study. It was late, too late for a casual chat. When I stepped inside, the room smelled of cigar smoke and expensive bourbon. My father sat behind his grand mahogany desk, his face cold, his jaw tight. And next to him, lounging like she owned the place, was Eleanor, his new wife, the woman who had slithered into our lives only a year after my mother's funeral. I never trusted Eleanor. She was too polished, too poised, like a venomous snake coiled and waiting. My mother had been warm, fierce, a woman of substance. Eleanor was her opposite, sharp eyes, sharp words, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Sit down, Adrian," my father said, his voice unnervingly calm. I sat, my stomach twisting into knots. And then, without hesitation, he said the words that shattered my world. "I'm removing you from my will." The words didn't make sense at first. I blinked. "What?" He leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against the desk. "I've given this a lot of thought. Blackwell Industries needs new leadership, someone who understands the modern world. Someone with vision." I scoffed. "I am that person. You trained me for this." His expression didn't change. "I've decided that Eleanor's daughter, Charlotte, will be the rightful heir to the company." Charlotte. A 19-year-old Instagram influencer whose biggest life achievement was picking a designer handbag. I laughed, but it came out hollow. "You can't be serious." Eleanor leaned forward, her red lips curling into a smirk. "Oh, he's very serious, Adrian. Charlotte has fresh ideas. She's young, adaptable, and, most importantly, loyal." The emphasis on the last word sent a chill through me. "You think I'm not loyal?" I asked, my voice shaking with rage. My father sighed, rubbing his temple as if he were the victim here. "It's not about loyalty, son. It's about business. And frankly, your attitude has always been challenging." Challenging? Because I had questioned Eleanor's involvement in board meetings she had no business attending? Because I didn't grovel like Charlotte? "You're making a mistake," I said, my fists clenching. "I am Blackwell Industries. I've spent my whole life preparing for this." Eleanor clicked her tongue. "And yet, you don't seem very grateful." I turned to my father. "You promised Mom. You told her this company would stay in the family, our family." Something flickered in his eyes, a brief flash of guilt, but it was gone in an instant. "Things change, Adrian. It's time for you to find your own path." I should have seen it coming. Eleanor had been whispering in his ear for years, slowly poisoning him against me, turning him into something unrecognizable. "You're kicking me out," I said quietly. My father hesitated, just for a second, before nodding. "You have until the end of the week to leave the house." I stared at him, waiting for a punchline that never came. He was serious. Everything inside me crumbled. This was my home. My birthright. And now, because of a gold-digging witch and her spoiled brat, I was being cast aside like trash. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the marble floor. "You're making a mistake," I said again, my voice trembling with barely contained fury. "One day, you'll regret this." Eleanor chuckled, swirling the bourbon in her glass. "We'll take our chances." I turned to my father one last time, hoping, praying, for a sign of hesitation, regret, anything to prove he still had a shred of love left for me. But all I saw was cold indifference. The rain was relentless as I walked out of the house for the last time. Each drop felt like a slap, a reminder of everything I had just lost. But if they thought I was going to disappear, they were wrong. They had taken everything from me. But I was going to take it all back. The first few weeks after my father cast me out were brutal. I had no money, no home, and no support system. My bank accounts? Frozen. My credit cards? Cancelled. My car? Repossessed. Every financial asset tied to my father's empire vanished overnight. One day, I was the heir to a multi-billion-dollar corporation. The next, I was a nobody, wandering the streets of New York with nothing but a suitcase and a phone that would soon be out of service. I crashed on a friend's couch for a while. Nick, my college roommate, was the only person who didn't turn his back on me. I told him everything: how Eleanor had manipulated my father, how I had been erased from my own legacy, how I wanted revenge. Nick sighed, handing me a beer. Forget revenge, man. You need to survive first. He was right. I was too busy being angry to realize I had nothing. For the first time in my life, I had to learn what it meant to struggle. I took odd jobs, bartending, doing data entry, anything that paid enough to keep me from sleeping on the streets. It was humiliating. I went from eating filet mignon at 5-star restaurants to rationing instant noodles in a shared apartment with 3 strangers. But anger? Anger kept me alive. Every rejection, every setback, every time I looked at my father's name in the headlines, it fueled me. I refused to be just another rich kid who fell from grace and disappeared. If my father thought I was unworthy of Blackwell Industries, I was going to build something bigger. The first break. It started small. One night, after a double shift at a bar, I overheard 2 finance guys drunkenly talking about a startup struggling to find investors. They were desperate for funding, but no one believed in them. I didn't have money, but I had knowledge. I had spent years studying corporate strategy, analyzing markets, and learning from the best. So I made them a deal. I told them I'd help restructure their company, make their pitch airtight, and find them investors in exchange for a stake in the company. They laughed at first. I was some washed-up heir with nothing to his name. But desperation makes people take risks. I spent the next 2 weeks reworking their entire business model. I sat in a cheap diner for hours, scribbling on napkins, making calls, using every connection I still had left. I pulled all-nighters, analyzing market trends, and writing proposals until my hands cramped. And when we pitched to investors? They bought in. I walked away with a 15% stake in a company that would be worth millions within 2 years. That first win? It changed everything. From hustle to empire. I kept grinding. I worked with small startups, helping them grow, taking small ownership shares instead of fees. It was slow, painful, and full of failures. But each time, I learned. I got smarter. I built a reputation. Within 3 years, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. I had built my own investment firm, Blackwell Capital. The name wasn't an accident. It was a statement. My father had taken my birthright, but I was reclaiming it in my own way. By year 5, I had equity in over a dozen successful startups, some of which had gone public. I wasn't a billionaire yet, but I was close. And then, in year 7, I bought my first company. A tech firm that had been struggling but had untapped potential. I took it, turned it around, and made it a powerhouse. It was the first real step in building my own empire. One acquisition led to another. Soon, I was no longer the disgraced heir, I was a self-made billionaire. People who once ignored me were now begging to work with me. And then, one day, my assistant walked into my office with a nervous expression. "Adrian," she said, placing a folder on my desk. "You're going to want to see this." I opened it. Inside was a proposal from Blackwell Industries. And at the bottom? My father's signature. I stared at it, my blood running cold. After all these years, after throwing me away like trash. He wanted something from me. And I was about to find out exactly what. I sat there, staring at the Blackwell Industries proposal on my desk, my fingers tightening around the edges of the folder. After all these years, after throwing me away, my father finally acknowledged me. And he needed my help. The irony was almost too much. I exhaled slowly and flipped through the documents. The numbers weren't pretty. Blackwell Industries was in trouble. Deep trouble. Years of bad investments, mismanagement, and unchecked spending had put my father's once mighty empire on the verge of collapse. Debt was piling up, profits were shrinking, and investors were getting nervous. And now, he wanted a bailout. From me. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair. For a long time, I had imagined this moment, what it would be like to finally have power over him, to make him feel the desperation I had felt. But now that it was real, I wasn't just angry. I was curious. What had happened to the mighty Jonathan Blackwell? There was only one way to find out. The meeting. 2 days later, I walked into the most expensive restaurant in Manhattan. Private dining room. Dim lighting. Soft classical music playing in the background. And at the center of it all? My father and Eleanor. They had aged. My father's once imposing figure looked smaller, his tailored suit hanging a little looser. His hair had grayed, and there were deep lines on his face: stress, failure, regret. Eleanor, on the other hand, still carried herself like a queen, but I noticed the cracks. The way her fingers twitched against her wine glass. The slight tightness in her smile. They needed me. And they knew it. Adrian, my father said, standing up like we were old friends. It's been a long time. I took my seat across from them, ignoring his outstretched hand. Not long enough. Eleanor forced a smile. You look successful. I smirked. I am. The tension was thick, almost suffocating. Finally, my father sighed, running a hand down his face. Adrian, I won't waste your time. Blackwell Industries is in a difficult position. We need an investor. A strong one. Someone who understands the company, who can bring in new leadership and restore confidence. I tilted my head. And by someone, you mean me? He nodded. Yes. I chuckled, shaking my head. You disowned me. Cut me off. Destroyed me. And now, you want me to save you? Eleanor leaned forward. Adrian, let's not dwell on the past. Business is business. We have an opportunity here to reunite as a family, to build something together. I raised an eyebrow. Together? She smiled. Yes. You'd become a major shareholder, of course. But we'd need to discuss the leadership structure. I already knew where this was going. And by leadership, I said, turning toward my father, you mean Charlotte? My father hesitated. Eleanor, however, had no shame. Charlotte has been preparing for this role for years. She's young, innovative, and unqualified, I interrupted. Eleanor's nostrils flared, but my father held up a hand. We're offering you a seat at the table, Adrian. A way to come back. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. Was this regret? Or just desperation? Tell me something, I said. Why now? Why not 5 years ago? Or 7? My father's jaw tightened. I already knew the answer. Because they didn't need me then. They never planned on needing me. But now? With their empire burning down around them? They were out of options. You think I owe you, I said, my voice calm. You think that, after everything you did, I should just come running back? Adrian, my father said, his voice strained. We're still family. I laughed. A cold, bitter laugh. You stopped being my family the night you threw me out, I said. And now, you want to use me. You want me to fix your mistakes, to put my name and money on the line to save a company that you handed to a spoiled child. Eleanor's face hardened. Watch your tone, Adrian. I turned to her, my eyes sharp. Or what? You'll take everything from me? Again? She flinched. Silence stretched between us. And then my father spoke. "You built an empire," he said quietly. "I won't deny that. You proved yourself. But Blackwell Industries, it's your legacy too. No matter how much anger you hold, it's in your blood." I stared at him, searching for something, anything, that might make me care. But all I saw was a broken man looking for a way to save himself. I stood up, buttoning my suit jacket. "You're right about one thing, Dad. I built an empire." I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice just enough to make them nervous. "But you made a mistake thinking I'd ever save yours." I placed the folder back on the table and slid it toward them. "Consider this my official rejection." My father's face fell. Eleanor's nails dug into the table. "You'll regret this," she hissed. I smiled. "No, Eleanor. You will." And with that, I walked out, leaving them to drown in the empire they had stolen from me. But I wasn't done yet. They thought I would just say no and leave it at that? Oh, no. I was going to make sure they lost everything. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was angry. Not because I was hurt. Because I was planning. My father and Eleanor thought they could manipulate me. Thought they could guilt me into saving them after destroying me. They thought I would walk away and let them continue their reign. They were wrong. Blackwell Industries wasn't just failing, it was on the edge of a cliff, teetering, waiting for the right push. And I was going to give it one. Step 1, the whisper. The first move in any corporate takedown? Control the narrative. Over the next few weeks, I fed rumors into the right ears. Whispers about internal chaos, financial mismanagement, crumbling investor confidence. I met with key shareholders, people who had once respected my father but now doubted his leadership. I didn't need to convince them that Blackwell Industries was a sinking ship. They already knew. All I had to do was plant the idea that the ship wasn't worth saving. And once the seed was planted, it spread like wildfire. Stock prices started dipping. Small, at first. A percentage point here, another there. Nothing drastic. Just enough to make people nervous. But nervous investors? They make rash decisions. Step 2, the strike. Next, I went after their partners. Blackwell Industries thrived on high-profile contracts, real estate developments, technology ventures, government deals. These weren't just business transactions. They were relationships built over decades. And relationships? They could be broken. I had spent the last 7 years building my own empire. I had powerful allies, CEOs, hedge fund managers, real estate moguls. People who trusted me more than they trusted my father. I started buying out their suppliers. Their logistics partners. Their subcontractors. One by one, the lifelines of Blackwell Industries started vanishing. Their costs skyrocketed. Projects stalled. Deadlines were missed. And when their investors asked why, the answer was always the same: Jonathan Blackwell had lost control. Step 3, the public execution. By now, Blackwell Industries was bleeding. Investors were panicking. It was time for the final blow. The scandal. Through careful research and a few well-placed sources, I uncovered exactly what I needed. It turned out, in their desperation to keep the company afloat, my father and Eleanor had engaged in some questionable financial practices. Offshore accounts. Embezzlement. Insider trading. Nothing too reckless, just enough to keep the company running while they figured out a way to stabilize it. But in the business world, a single scandal is enough to destroy everything. I made sure it went public. News outlets picked it up within hours. Blackwell Industries under investigation for financial misconduct. Stock prices plummeted overnight. By the end of the week, Blackwell Industries had lost half its value. And the board? They turned on my father. Step 4, the coup. The final move was poetic. After years of being cast aside, after being thrown away like trash, I walked into the Blackwell Industries boardroom. Not as a disgraced heir. Not as a pawn in my father's empire. But as the man who now owned the majority stake. You see, while Blackwell Industries was crashing, I was buying. Through shell companies, through allies, through calculated trades, I had slowly acquired enough stock to take control. And when the dust settled, I stood at the head of the table, looking down at my father and Eleanor. His face was pale. Hers was twisted in rage. I let the silence stretch. Let them feel it. The weight of their downfall. And then, I said the words I had waited years to say. "You're fired." Eleanor gasped. "You can't do this." I smiled. "I just did." The board didn't protest. They had already voted them out. Blackwell Industries? It was mine now. The aftermath. My father left without a word. Eleanor? She tried to threaten me, tried to remind me of the power she once had. But she wasn't powerful anymore. She was nothing. And Charlotte? She was nowhere to be found. Probably hiding, waiting for someone to clean up the mess. But there was no one left. Blackwell Industries was mine. And while I could have kept it, while I could have rebuilt it, I didn't. I sold it. Piece by piece. Everything my father had built, everything Eleanor had stolen, I dismantled. Not out of spite. Not out of anger. But because it was never mine to begin with. My empire? I had built that on my own. And that was worth more than anything they had ever given me. It took a few weeks for the dust to settle. The headlines were brutal. Blackwell Industries collapses amid scandal. Jonathan Blackwell forced out of his own company. Once a titan, now a ghost, the fall of an empire. Investors abandoned ship. The board moved on. And my father? He disappeared. For the first time in my life, Jonathan Blackwell was irrelevant. And yet, even after everything, I felt empty. I had won. I had taken back everything they stole from me, and more. But instead of satisfaction, all I felt was an ache. I told myself it was nothing. Just the aftershock of war. But deep down, I knew I had unfinished business. So when I got a message from my father's old assistant, one that simply read, "He wants to see you," I didn't hesitate. The meeting. I found him in a quiet, rundown cafe on the outskirts of the city. No bodyguards. No expensive suit. Just an old man sitting in a corner booth, nursing a black coffee. I barely recognized him. Jonathan Blackwell had always been larger than life. Impeccable. Powerful. But now? He looked small. He didn't stand when I approached. Didn't greet me with his usual arrogance. He just looked up with tired eyes and said, "Sit." I did. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then, finally, he sighed. "I suppose I should congratulate you." I leaned back, folding my arms. For what? A ghost of a smile flickered across his face. Winning. I shook my head. It was never about winning, Dad. It was about justice. He scoffed. Justice? You think what you did was just? You threw me away. My voice was cold, steady. You let that woman manipulate you into turning your back on your own son. You handed my legacy to a girl who didn't earn it. And then, when everything fell apart, you came crawling back, not because you regretted it, but because you needed me. He exhaled, rubbing his temple. I made mistakes. I laughed, but it came out bitter. That's one way to put it. Silence again. Then, for the first time in his life, my father looked ashamed. You were always the better man, he admitted. I just didn't want to see it. I frowned. This wasn't the Jonathan Blackwell I had grown up with. He was always so sure, so untouchable. What had changed? As if reading my mind, he sighed. I lost everything, Adrian. Eleanor left the moment the money dried up. Charlotte refuses to speak to me. The people who once respected me won't even return my calls. I watched him carefully. And what do you want from me? He shook his head. Nothing. There's nothing left for me to take. For the first time since this all began, I saw him not as my enemy, but as a broken man who had lost everything. And I didn't know how to feel about that. I expected to hate him. I expected to want to see him suffer. But sitting there, across from him? All I felt was pity. I could have lashed out. Could have told him he deserved it. Could have walked away without a second thought. But instead, I said the one thing I never thought I would. I didn't do this to destroy you, Dad. He looked up, surprised. I did it because you left me no choice, I said. I spent years wondering why I wasn't enough. Why you let her turn you against me. And I realized something, it was never about me. It was about you. You were weak. You let greed, love, and fear control you. And when you made your choice, you expected me to just disappear. I shook my head. I'm not you. I don't roll over and accept my fate. He swallowed hard. No, you don't. For the first time, he actually looked proud. It didn't change anything. Didn't erase the years of betrayal. But maybe, just maybe, it was enough. I stood up, sliding a black card across the table. He looked down at it, confused. What is this? A way out, I said simply. It's access to a private account. Enough to live quietly somewhere. No luxury, no empires, just peace. But if you ever try to get back into the game, if you ever come near me again, I will bury you for good. His hands shook as he picked up the card. Why? He asked. I met his gaze. Because despite everything, you're still my father. And I'm not like you. He nodded slowly, understanding. As I turned to leave, he spoke one last time. Adrian. I stopped. For what it's worth. I'm sorry. I didn't turn around. Instead, I just said, I know. And then, I walked away. For good. It had been a year since I walked out of that cafe. A year since I left my father behind for good. In that time, everything changed. Blackwell Industries was gone. The name that once carried so much weight now lived only in history books. Eleanor vanished into obscurity. Last I heard, she was bouncing between wealthy acquaintances, trying to con her way into another fortune. Charlotte? She tried to salvage her influencer career, but once the world saw her for what she was, a fraud, no one cared anymore. As for my father? He disappeared. Cashed out what little I gave him and left the city. No press, no scandals. Just, gone. And me? I was richer than ever. More powerful than ever. I had everything I once thought I wanted. But the truth? It wasn't enough. The realization. It hit me one evening as I stood in my penthouse, looking over the New York skyline. I had one. I had everything. But for the first time in years, I asked myself, what now? I built my empire out of anger. Out of revenge. Out of the desire to prove that I was more than what they took from me. But now that the fight was over? What was left? I thought back to the nights I spent sleeping on a friend's couch. The nights I stayed up, grinding, building, pushing forward, not because I wanted wealth, but because I had no other choice. That hunger? That fire? It was gone. Because I had spent so long looking back that I never thought about what came next. The shift. The next morning, I did something that shocked even myself. I called Nick, my old college roommate, the only friend who had stuck by me when I lost everything. Nick, I said, staring out at the city. I think I'm done. He laughed. Done with what? With all of it, I admitted. The power games, the money chases, the wars. I spent my whole life proving I was worth something. Now I know I am. There was a pause. Then, so what do you want to do? That was the question, wasn't it? I thought about the startups I had invested in, the struggling businesses I had turned into giants. Maybe it was time to give back. Not for power. Not for revenge. But because I could. The new chapter. 6 months later, I stepped down as CEO of Blackwell Capital. I wasn't retiring. Far from it. But I was done with hoarding power. Instead, I launched something new, the Blackwell Initiative. A venture fund, but not for the elite. Not for the already successful. For the underdogs. For the people like me. The ones who had been kicked down, cast out, told they weren't enough. I traveled. Met young entrepreneurs, struggling visionaries, people with brilliant minds but no opportunities. And for the first time in years, I felt something real. Not anger. Not vengeance. Purpose. The last visit. One day, while in Paris for a business meeting, I found myself standing in front of an old bookstore. I wasn't sure why I went in. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was fate. But there, sitting in a quiet corner with a cup of coffee, was my father. He looked different. Not broken. Not lost. Just at peace. For a moment, I considered walking away. Leaving him to whatever life he had built. But then he looked up and our eyes met. And for the first time in years, he smiled. Not with regret. Not with desperation. Just a quiet, genuine smile. I didn't sit down. Didn't say a word. I just nodded. And he nodded back. It was enough. The true victory. As I walked out of that bookstore and into the streets of Paris, I realized something. I had spent my whole life thinking revenge would be the ultimate victory. But I was wrong. Walking away was. And for the first time in a long time, I was finally free.